In August of 1862, the American Civil War was going very poorly for the North. General George McClellan's ill-fated Peninsula Campaign had dashed any hopes for a short and relatively painless war. Abraham Lincoln needed 300,000 more soldiers to fight in his crusade, and new units were being formed all over the North. In Maine, a regiment of 3-year volunteers was gathering just outside the city of Portland, a place called Camp Mason. The men were mostly farmers and lumberjacks. Their commanding officer was a colonel named Adelbert Ames, a West Point graduate just 14 months out of school and already covered in glory, having distinguished himself for bravery at the First Battle of Bull Run. This new group of volunteers was to be designated as the 20th Regiment, Maine Volunteer Infantry. Just under Colonel Ames in the chain of command was a lieutenant colonel by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He was handsome and educated with a deep, resonant voice. He taught rhetoric and oratory at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. Chamberlain had requested a leave to go to war. The college refused, so he requested a leave of absence for the purpose of visiting Europe. Leave was granted, whereupon he promptly went to the state capital in Augusta and secured a commission as lieutenant colonel of volunteers. The governor had offered to make Chamberlain a full colonel, but Chamberlain declined, thinking it wiser to learn the business of soldiering first. In those days, most officers were appointed by the governor, and often appointments were based on political connections rather than military merit.
Well, he was a really remarkable person, a very determined person. If you look at a series of pictures covering his whole life, you see these determined eyes all the way from the time when he was a young man to a year or so before he died, these sort of eagle eyes.
Because of the 20th Maine's scattered origin, no county or city claimed it. No one presented them with a flag, and there was no home state send-off when they departed. They took a train to Boston, where they boarded a steamer that took them to Washington, D.C. Among the private soldiers who volunteered was a 16-year-old boy named Theodore Garish. He was from a rustic county. Although no photographs of Mr. Garish can be located, he wrote eloquently of his experiences. As they boarded the steamer, Private Garish recalled,
"With moist eyes and heart strangely throbbing, I stood in the midst of the crowd, pressed against the steamer's rail, and looked toward the city, now fast receding from view. But I saw not the countless domes and spires of the great town. I was thinking of home, and seemed to me like a picture on the distant sky, a great forest, a small clearing on the hillside, a little cottage home, and a circle of dear friends as they stood with tearful eyes to say goodbye, as I thus took my departure from home."
When they arrived in Washington, the 20th Maine was assigned to the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Corps, Army of the Potomac, otherwise known as Butterfield's Light Brigade, which was also known as Butterfield's Thieves, a rather dubious distinction that the men had earned on the Peninsula Campaign for their efficient foraging methods. Even though General Dan Butterfield, who had composed the now famous taps, was no longer with the brigade, he had built his men into a tightly knit group. The Mainers did not make a very good first impression. Marching back to camp after drawing their first muskets, the drummers kept such poor time and the soldiers were so out of step that onlookers and veteran soldiers jeered them along the way. Mortified, Colonel Ames shouted, "If you can't do any better than you have tonight, you better all desert and go home."
he was horrified when he first saw the people in the 20th Maine. They would, instead of giving him a smart military salute, they would just say, "Howdy do, Colonel," or something like that, and they'd, instead of standing in an erect military posture, they would lean up against a fence or something like that. He was thoroughly disgusted. In fact, he said at one point, "This is a hell of a regiment," and that was his opinion.
Meanwhile, flushed with his recent successes in Virginia, General Lee and his army invaded Maryland and had taken possession of Frederick City. On September 12th, only 5 days after the Mainers' arrival in Washington, the Army of the Potomac under General George McClellan marched in pursuit of the rebels. The resulting confrontation was the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, and it was the single bloodiest day in American history. It was fortunate for the 20th Maine that McClellan held the 5th Corps in reserve that day. They were still green, and the Mainers would have been no match for Lee's battle-hardened troops. The battle ended in a draw, but Lee had managed to successfully stand up to a force twice his size and still escape. McClellan chose not to pursue the Confederates back into Virginia, and Colonel Ames wisely used this time to drill the men and whip them into shape.
Attention! Company! Front! In each rank! Count 2!
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1.
They learned how to load their muskets by the numbers, repeating their drills over and over again until it became automatic. They learned how to maneuver as a unit, drilling at such tasks as march by the flank and filing into line.
Company! Right face!
But military discipline did not come easy.
Shoulder! Arms!
One of the most difficult things in the world for a genuine Yankee to do was to settle down and become accustomed to the experience of a soldier's life. Accustomed to be independent, the words "go" and "come" grated harshly upon his ear. At home, he had considered himself as good as any other person, and in the army he failed to understand why a couple of gilt straps upon the shoulders of one who at home was far beneath him should there make him so much his superior.
At night, Colonel Ames personally tutored Joshua Chamberlain in tactics and the art of warfare, staying up long after taps had sounded, studying by candlelight. Little by little, the men learned how to soldier. Joshua Chamberlain's brother Tom, who was a sergeant in the 20th Maine, wrote home to his mother.
"I wish you could hear Lawrence give off a command and see him ride along the battalion on his white horse. He looks splendidly. Lawrence told me last night that he never felt so well in his life."
On November 7th, President Lincoln removed McClellan from command because of his failure to pursue the rebels and replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside of Rhode Island. Burnside was a large, imposing man with tremendous whiskers and an amiable personality. For Burnside, the rallying cry was, "On to Richmond," and off they went. As the Union Army advanced through Virginia, the weather became bitterly cold. On December 6th, 4 inches of snow fell. The Mainers quickly learned that going south was no escape from cold weather. 2 of their soldiers froze to death. The road to Richmond led through Fredericksburg, the boyhood home of George Washington. It was a picturesque little town, with handsome church spires nestled by a narrow river called the Rappahannock. Problem was, Fredericksburg was occupied by the Confederate Army, and when the Federals arrived, they chose to camp just across the river, preferring to wait for pontoons to make the crossing. They waited for over a week. Meanwhile, the Confederates wisely used the time to bring up reinforcements and dig in. Under the direction of Lieutenant General James Longstreet, CSA, They placed themselves onto a hill just beyond town called Marie's Heights, and down near the foot of the hill was a stone wall, just the right height for shooting over. The wall was separated from town by an open plain that created a perfect killing zone. When Longstreet gave Lee a tour of his defenses, he proclaimed that not even a chicken could make it across the field, and he was right. On December 13, 1862, after much harassment from Confederate sharpshooters, the Union Army crossed the river into Fredericksburg and assembled to launch its attack against the rebel positions. The 20th Maine, as part of General Joseph Hooker's Right Grand Division, was held in reserve when the day began. Sitting across the river, they witnessed the battle unfolding from a distance. Late that afternoon, the 5th Corps was called up. As the 20th Maine crossed the pontoon bridge into Fredericksburg, Colonel Chamberlain observed,
"The air was thick with the flying, bursting shells. Whooping solid shots swept lengthwise to our narrow bridge, driving the compressed air so close above our heads that there was an unconquerable instinct to shrink beneath it."
Once beyond the town, the men formed a battle line, getting ready to take their turn as the conflict swirled around them. And when the line was formed, Colonel Ames called to Chamberlain above the din, "God help us now. Colonel, take the right wing, I must lead here." With that, Ames calmly walked to the front of the line, and the men began to move forward. One soldier whose group had charged on the heights earlier in the day and was pinned down saw the 20th Maine advancing.
They were coming across the field in line of battle, as upon parade. It was a grand sight, and a striking example of what discipline will do for such material in such a battle.
The Mainers swept forward, but it was late in the day and darkness had begun to set in. The men reached a small rise that was their objective, fired off a few futile volleys, and hunkered down against the ground. Thus began what was to be the most miserable night of their lives. Pinned down and unable to render aid, they listened to the moans and cries of the wounded all night. To make matters even worse, the men had discarded their coats back in town. It was freezing cold.
For myself, it seemed best to bestow my body between two dead men among the many left there by earlier assaults, and to draw another crosswise for a pillow out of the trampled, blood-soaked sod, pulling the flap of his coat over my face to fend off the chilling winds, and still more chilling, the deep, many-voiced moan that spread over the field.
The next day, the Mainers were still pinned down. To protect themselves, they piled up the dead into breastworks. It worked, but they had to lie there and listen to bullets thudding into the bodies of their lifeless comrades. That night, orders finally came to withdraw. But first, and perhaps feeling a certain sense of obligation to their dead comrades, the survivors dug shallow graves with their bayonets and buried the dead, identifying the corpses as best they could. It began a practice that the Mainers would follow through almost every battlefield until the end of the war. Exhausted, the men returned to what was left of Fredericksburg. That night it was decided to abandon town. The Union Army was to retreat back across the river. The boys of the 20th Maine, however, had one piece of unfinished business to attend to before they could go. Their orders were to form the rear guard and cover for the army as it slipped back across the river. As the men were digging a line, Lieutenant Colonel Chamberlain, supervising the work in darkness, heard someone throwing dirt in the wrong spot. As he approached, he whispered into the void, "Throw to the other side, my man, that's where the danger is." His reply was, "Golly, don't you suppose I know which side them Yanks be? They're right onto us now." Without skipping a beat, Chamberlain told the man in a rich southern drawl to continue, but keep a sharp lookout. Their brigade was the last to leave the city. Their regiment was the last to cross back over the river. The Battle of Fredericksburg was over. It was a profound defeat for the Union, But the 20th Maine had proven itself able in hot combat. Colonel Ames was proud of his men. In January of 1863, General Burnside, intent on making up for his loss at Fredericksburg, ordered the army to march upriver with the intention of outflanking the rebels. But no sooner had they started than the skies opened up with a torrential downpour. The rain turned the whole countryside into a big bowl of muddy soup. Entire wagon teams were swallowed. Movement came to a standstill and fights broke out. The Confederates, watching from the other side of the narrow river, taunted them with signs that read, "Burnside, stuck in the mud." Hopelessly bogged down, Burnside ordered his army back to Falmouth.
Well, after the mud march, there was a ditty going around camp that went something like this. Now I lay me down to sleep in mud that's 40 fathoms deep. If you're here when I awake, just hunt me up with an oyster rake.
But these twin humiliations were more than President Lincoln could take. He removed Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac and replaced him this time with the popular General Joseph Hooker. The winter of 1863 passed, and with spring, the Army's confidence in itself had been restored. Hooker had made ambitious plans for an offensive that, like Burnside's, involved marching upriver and outflanking the Confederates, smashing them, and ending the war. But the 20th Maine was not to take part in this great triumph. They had received faulty vaccinations, and a number of men came down with smallpox. The medical department ordered the entire 20th Maine quarantined, which made them unfit for combat duty.
Chamberlain wanted to get into the fight. He went to the commanding general and of course was refused, but he said, well, it'll put us in, at least we could give the enemy the smallpox.
Not wishing to miss out on all the action, Colonel Ames got himself transferred to General George Meade's staff at Corps headquarters and was able to go off and fight the rebels at Chancellorsville. Of course, the Battle of Chancellorsville was a spectacular defeat for General Hooker and a brilliant victory for General Lee. The men of the 20th Maine escaped this embarrassment. But one effect that the battle did have on them was that Colonel Ames, having made a good account of himself, was promoted to brigadier general. Upon his departure, Joshua Chamberlain was made a full colonel and given command of the 20th Maine. Soon after, in late May, it happened that the 2nd Maine was being mustered out as a regiment. This was because its ranks were filled with a large number of 2-year enlistees whose term of service was up. But it also consisted of a number of 3-year men who still had a year left to serve. It was decided to transfer the 3-year men to the 20th Maine in an effort to help fill its depleted ranks. But as circumstances would have it, many of these 3-year men had enlisted right alongside the 2-year men, only they had signed different papers without realizing it. The 3-year men thought they ought to be able to return home with the others, but it was not to be, much to their consternation, and they had to be delivered to the 20th Maine under guard. Chamberlain was told to shoot any of the men who failed to do their duty.
Well, he didn't want to do that, and so he went to headquarters and got permission to handle the thing in his own, handle the affair in his own way. And as a result, most of them did return to duty and fought with the 20th Maine at Little Round Top. And had they, more than 100 really battle-hardened and seasoned veterans, and if they hadn't been present, the battle most probably would have gone the other way. So this was a small example of leadership in a small matter that really turned into a big, had a great effect on history.
In early June of 1863, General Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were on the move again. Supremely confident of their abilities, their intention was to bring the war to northern soil. When Hooker became aware that the Confederate Army was on the move, he ordered the Union Army to march also, always careful to protect Washington, D.C. The weather was hot and the marches were grueling. Summer was at its height. They marched 20 and 30 miles a day in 100-degree heat with full loads on their backs. Men were dropping like flies from heat exhaustion and sunstroke. Still, Washington had to be protected at all costs. Yet another crisis of command was brewing. Lincoln's confidence in Hooker had plummeted. On June 28th, he removed Hooker from command, replacing him with the 20th Maine's Corps commander, General Meade. Meade wasted no time in sending out cavalry probes to seek out an immediate confrontation with Lee's army. He found it on July 1st, in a sleepy little town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg was fought without the 5th Corps, which was still on the road. It was a great victory for the rebels, and their confidence was high. The whole country sensed that this was to be the decisive battle of the war. When the morning of July 2nd dawned, the Union Army found itself on the southern outskirts of Gettysburg. General Meade's Corps commanders had formed a defensive line on high ground. It extended from a place called Culp's Hill, along Cemetery Ridge, and all the way to a hill called Little Round Top, over a mile away. Meade had a good defensive position, knew it, and intended to stay there. However, the Corps commander of the southern end, a politically appointed general by the name of Daniel Sickles, did not like his position. Disobeying orders, he moved his 3rd Corps forward, vacated Little Round Top, and broke contact with the rest of the army. Lee, for his part, had deployed his army out in a line about 1 mile in front of the Federals. Due to the almost mythic stature of the Southern fighting man, Lee was supremely confident in his ability to defeat the Yankees. So it came to pass that Lee ordered his army to attack the entrenched Union flanks. Fortunately, Meade had a chief engineer by the name of G.K. Warren. He was a slight, almost effeminate-looking man who had graduated at the top of his class at West Point and gone into the elite topographical engineers. He went up to inspect the lines and was horrified to find Little Round Top almost deserted.
He saw some movement apparently out to the left and suspected that Longstreet's Corps was beginning a massive attack coming toward them. He ordered a battery station there to fire a shot down into the woods, and when the shot was fired, the Confederate soldiers reacted in such a way that they could see the gleam of their muskets and all that. And Warren detected the approach of the Confederate troops and sent for reinforcements.
Warren quickly summoned the closest available Union troops, which happened to be the road-weary 1st Division of the 5th Corps, which had just arrived after a 26-mile march.
Go! Go! Drive! Drive! Go!
They rushed up the slopes of Little Round Top under the hail of a Confederate artillery barrage. The 20th Maine was part of a brigade commanded by a Colonel Strong Vincent from New York. Colonel Vincent put Colonel Chamberlain and his Maine boys on the extreme left of Little Round Top, telling him, "This is the left of the Union line. You understand? You are to hold this ground at all costs." To their right was the rest of the brigade. To their left, nothing. Knowing that he had no support, Chamberlain sent out a company to guard his exposed flank, Company B, led by Captain Walter G. Morrill. Off went the men. They disappeared down the slope and were soon forgotten. Up front, the Confederate attack was gaining momentum. Sickles' position was crumbling, and enemy forces were advancing onto their little patch of land. Meanwhile, Brigadier General Evander McIver Law, CSA, had also marched 28 miles that day with his brigade of Alabamans. They were hot and thirsty, but were thrown immediately into battle, ordered to take the right flank of the Union lines. But harassed by Union sharpshooters, the Alabamans drove up the slopes of Big Round Top, and as they made their way down the hillside toward Little Round Top, Colonel Oates of the 15th Alabama glimpsed Meade's artillery park through the valley between. He knew that Little Round Top was the key to the entire Union position, and seizing the opportunity, he went for the prize. On the back slope of Little Round Top, the 20th Maine kept a lonely and tense vigil, waiting for the attack. By now, the Confederates were advancing on Little Round Top itself.
I know not who gave the first fire, or which line received the first lead. I only know that the carnage began. Our regiment was mantled in fire and smoke. How rapidly the cartridges were torn from the boxes and stuffed in the smoking muzzles of the guns. How the men's hands and faces grew grim and black with burning powder. How our officers bravely encouraged the men to hold on and recklessly expose themselves. The enemy was pouring a terrible fire upon us, his superior forces giving him a great advantage. The air seemed alive with lead.
The fighting had no sooner started when several of Chamberlain's men noticed a mass of gray moving along the valley between the two round tops. In a moment of keen insight, Chamberlain understood what was happening and ordered the men to spread out into a single line. It extended toward the rear at right angles in an L shape, so that the back of Little Round Top would be protected from a rear attack. For an hour and a half, the Mainers fought off repeated attacks by superior numbers, forcing the Alabamans back down the slopes.
The edge of conflict swayed to and fro with wild whirlpools and eddies. At times, I saw around me more of the enemy than of my own men. Gaps opening, swallowing, closing again with sharp, convulsive energy. Squads of stalwart men who had cut their way through us, disappearing as if translated. All around, a strange, mingled roar.
Two of the holdout mutineers from the 2nd Maine, realizing the desperate character of the struggle in front of them, picked up rifles and threw themselves into the battle. For Colonel Oates and his Alabamans, the fight was just as desperate.
Captain Brainerd, one of the bravest and best officers in the regiment leading his company, fell forward, exclaiming, "Oh God, that I could see my mother," and instantly expired. Lieutenant John Oates, my dear brother, succeeded to the command of the company, but was pierced through by a number of bullets and fell mortally wounded. The carnage in the ranks was appalling. My dead and wounded were then nearly as great in number as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks.
Still, the Confederates charged. Worse yet, the men were beginning to run out of ammunition. The soldiers were reduced to picking cartridge boxes off the dead and wounded. Chamberlain could see the Confederates gathering for yet another assault, which he knew his men could not withstand. But their orders were to hold the ground at all costs. They couldn't engage in another firefight with no ammunition, and they couldn't withdraw either. Then, in a flash of desperate inspiration, Chamberlain decided that his only way out was to launch a bayonet charge. And owing to the angular formation of his troops, it would have to be a swinging arc that would wheel around until they formed a straight line. Then all would rush forward.
The order is given fixed bayonets, and the steel shanks of the bayonets rattled upon the rifle barrel. Charge, bayonets, charge! Every man understood in a moment that the movement was our only salvation. But there is a limit to human endurance, and for a brief moment the order was not obeyed, and the little line seemed to quail under the fearful fire that was being poured upon them. Lieutenant H.S. Melcher, an officer who had worked his way up from the ranks, saw the situation and did not hesitate. With a cheer and a flash of his sword that sent an inspiration along the line, a full 10 paces to the front he sprang. Come on, boys," he shouts. The color sergeant and the brave color guard follow, and with one wild yell of anguish wrung from its tortured heart, the regiment charge.
The Alabamans were taken completely by surprise. The Mainers were upon them before they knew what was happening. It was at that moment that the forgotten Company B, commanded by Captain Walter G. Morrill, saw its opportunity and popped up from behind its hiding place and fired a volley into the Confederates' rear. Suddenly, Oates and his men were taking fire from all sides. Some were shot in the face, while other men were shot in the back. The staggered Alabamans, reeling from the shock of this double onslaught, began to panic. Colonel Oates thought his men were surrounded.
I had the officers and men advised as best I could that when the signal was given that we should not try to retreat in order, but everyone should run in the direction from whence we came. When the signal was given, we ran like a herd of wild cattle right through the line of dismounted cavalrymen.
The Mainers swept down the hill and pursued the Alabamans for a distance, but they eventually came to a halt, lest they ventured too far in front of the rest of the army. They rounded up 400 prisoners and walked back to Little Round Top, but not before passing over what had been their day's work. The slaughter was appalling, prodigious. The Confederates had suffered a baffling defeat. Less than half of Colonel Oates' once mighty regiment returned to their lines. Later, in a case of classic understatement, Oates would reflect that great events sometimes turn on comparatively small affairs. Eventually, darkness came and news spread of their accomplishment. That night, General Ames, now a brigadier general in the 11th Corps, called on his old regiment. He said that he was proud of the 20th. Coming from the man who had once told them all to desert and go home, that must have certainly meant something. Later, Corporal William T. Livermore recorded the day's events.
The regiment we fought and captured was the 15th Alabama. They fought like demons and said they never were whipped before and never wanted to meet the 20th Maine again.
The next day, July 3rd, the 20th Maine lay in reserve. Lee had come so close to success the day before he could almost taste it. General Meade, for his part, had correctly divined that Lee, having failed on a flanking attack, would next try the center of the Union lines. Sure enough, 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched across a mile of open ground on a doomed attack that has since become known as Pickett's Charge. And with that last ray of hope snuffed out, Lee's bold move into Pennsylvania ended in failure. The Army of the Potomac had been handed its first major victory. Afterwards, the 20th Maine gathered the dead and buried them on the back slope of Little Round Top, making crude headboards from ammunition boxes. Casualties for the 3 days fighting totaled over 50,000 men from both armies. The Union Army pursued the retreating Confederates, but the rebels were eventually able to escape back across the Potomac intact. The two armies came to confront each other several more times before the year ended, but nothing much came of it. The Federals set up camp near Culpeper, Virginia, and closed out the year of 1863. The Army of the Potomac spent the winter months replenishing its depleted ranks. The Confederates had no such luxury. In the spring of 1864, President Abraham Lincoln revived the old rank of Lieutenant General and placed Ulysses S. Grant in command of all the Union armies. When Grant assumed command, he chose to make his home with the Army of the Potomac. The campaign that they were about to engage in would be unlike anything before, because up to this point, fighting had been intense but sporadic. Now it would be one long, continuous struggle without respite, and it would be known as the Wilderness Campaign. Everywhere Grant took the army, Lee was there first, with his troops dug in and waiting. From the wilderness to Spotsylvania, the North Anna River, and finally Cold Harbor. The Army fought for 40 days without let-up. It was an incredibly bloody affair. Finally, Grant and Meade, weary of the stalemate from trying to take Richmond from the north, decided to try from the south. They fixed their sights on Petersburg, through which many of the transportation and supply lines for Richmond passed.
Easy! Take your time! Take your time!
On June 18th, the 20th Maine advanced near Petersburg through woods and were ordered to hold themselves in reserve. Colonel Chamberlain, however, who was now commanding the division's 1st Brigade, had been ordered to storm a heavily defended position from across a stretch of open land. He obeyed under protest. As he turned to give a command, he was struck by a mini-ball that pierced his body from hip to hip. Amazingly, he remained on his feet, balanced himself on his sword, blood gushing out of both sides of his body, and waved his men on until they had all passed. Then Chamberlain collapsed to the ground. Later, his ruined body was picked off the ground and brought to the rear. There, the surgeon who examined him declared his wounds mortal. Upon hearing of Chamberlain's brave exploits and thinking him about to die, General Grant issued a special order promoting him to Brigadier General, the only instance of such a promotion during the Civil War. But Joshua Chamberlain's brother Tom wouldn't let the surgeons give up on him, and through their persistence they were able to patch him up. Chamberlain's life would be spared, and so the former college professor was shipped off to a hospital in Annapolis, a general. As to the events of June 18th, the unsuccessful attack by Union forces on Petersburg gave way to siege warfare. 9 months of mud, trenches, and death lay ahead. In November, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president, and Chamberlain, somewhat recovered from his injuries, was back on the lines. 1865 arrived with little change in the situation before Petersburg, except that the two sides extended their lines further and further. The Union forces, with their inexhaustible supply of manpower and materiel, knew the advantage was theirs. Hunger and desertions were sapping the strength of the Army of Northern Virginia. On March 25, 1865, Lee, in desperation, launched a surprise attack against the Union lines. But they were repelled with heavy losses. Grant, sensing Lee's situation, ordered the planned spring offensive to begin immediately. Sheridan's cavalry, along with Meade's 5th Corps, were assigned the task of making a flanking thrust around the extreme right end of Lee's lines. It was March 29th, a warm spring day. General Chamberlain was in the lead of the 1st Division, going up the Quaker Road. The Confederates had set up a line of resistance along the road at a place called Gravely Run. when they collided, Chamberlain pitched his men into battle. His horse had galloped too far out in front of his men, and as Chamberlain reined him in, the horse reared. A bullet that was aimed at Chamberlain struck the neck of the horse.
The bullet struck the horse's neck and went up Chamberlain's arm, struck a brass-mounted mirror in his pocket and went around and round his ribs and gave him a very painful wound.
For a moment, it seemed as if the blow were fatal. General Charles Griffin witnessed the scene and rode over as Chamberlain was coming to. Looking him over, Griffin proclaimed, "My dear General, you are gone," thinking he was about to die. Chamberlain looked up and replied, "Yes, General, I am," thinking that Griffin was referring to his scattering troops who would be gone unless he did something about it in a hurry. Immediately, Chamberlain straightened himself up in his saddle, kicked his spurs, and rode away from the astonished Griffin into the midst of his scattering troops. Chamberlain's gallant display inspired his men to rally. They charged into the breastworks again. Eventually, Chamberlain's horse faded from loss of blood, and the general was forced to dismount. Colonel Ellis Spear of the 20th Maine came up to him in that moment and offered Chamberlain a pull of wine from his flask, which he took. It was noticed that Colonel Spear's eyes became melancholy as Chamberlain drained the flask. But the outcome of the battle was still anything but certain, and Griffin returned with a worried look on his face. An old artillerist, he shouted to Chamberlain, "If you can hold on there for 10 minutes, I will give you a battery." Someone gave Chamberlain a new horse, and he dashed back to his men, shouting, "Once more, try the steel. Held for 10 minutes, and we are out of it." The men held on, and the promised artillery soon buzzed overhead. The Union infantry launched yet another attack. This time, the Confederate defenders gave way and retreated. The road to the main lines had been opened, and Chamberlain had once more distinguished himself in a sensational manner. Later, General Chamberlain would receive a brevet commission of Major General for the work he did that day. On April 1st, the Bluecoats found themselves at a place called Five Forks, the last road connecting Richmond with the rest of the South.
The South Side Railroad was of great importance to General Lee, because over that road he brought all the provisions for his army in Richmond and Petersburg. It was the lifeline that connected the Confederacy and its capital. If that line of connection was cut, Richmond must be abandoned.
As it so happened, Sheridan's reconnaissance incorrectly showed the Confederate defenses extending further than they actually did. And when orders for the attack were relayed to the 5th Corps, 10,000 soldiers went bounding off into the woods, completely missing their target. It wasn't until General Chamberlain heard gunfire off to his left and went to have a look that he discovered the error. Still, as luck would have it, they had marched completely unnoticed behind the Confederate lines. Realizing their good fortune, Chamberlain wheeled his troops around and advanced on the rear of the Confederate breastworks. As Chamberlain later described, it was like shutting jaws. Sheridan, who had been galloping all over the field that day, saw Chamberlain putting his troops into battle. "By God, that's what I like to see," he roared. "General officers at the front." The 20th Maine was traveling in the rear of General Griffin's division and had also overshot the Confederate lines. When they turned around, the Mainers, along with the 1st Michigan, were now leading. They crept up to enemy lines so quietly, they caught the rebels totally by surprise. Yelling as they charged down into the Confederate rear, the rebels threw down their guns and surrendered on the spot. The problem was, they outnumbered the Yankees about 10-1.
They soon discovered the superiority of their numbers and the mistake they had made in surrendering. A large portion of our men had gone to the rear with prisoners when a rebel officer came dashing down the line, calling upon them to rally. A rebel who had surrendered was standing near Colonel Morrill, and catching up from the ground a loaded rifle, yelled with an oath, "We can whip you yet," deliberately shot a captain of the 1st Michigan Regiment who stood beside him. At the same moment, a private of Company D in our regiment thrust his bayonet through the breast of the treacherous rebel, who fell dead at his feet. In a moment's time, the battle was raging all along our line.
Once again, the 20th Maine found itself in the center of a desperate and pitched battle against vastly superior numbers. Other brigades rushed in as quick as they could, but it wasn't until the cavalry came dashing up and threw in its weight that the Confederates broke and ran. Nearly 5,000 rebel prisoners were taken that day. It was a stunning victory for the North, and everyone in the ranks sensed that it heralded the imminent end of the war. The only sour note of the day was that the commander of the 5th Corps, General Warren, had been unjustly accused by Sheridan of being tardy. Sheridan had ordered General Warren to be immediately removed from command. That night, Private Garish and a friend went by candlelight back to the scene of the fight. They were looking for 2 dead companions and had come to bury them.
We dug 2 shallow graves under the shadow of a great oak tree and buried them side by side. We placed boards at their heads, telling their names, company, and regiment, and there left the remains of 2 men as brave and fearless as any who had ever breathed the air of patriotism and liberty.
With the fall of the junction at 5 Forks, General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had no choice but to evacuate Richmond and escape west toward Lynchburg. Their only hope was to try and join forces with the remnants of Joe Johnston's army and go from there, but it was not to be. Little more than a week later, on April 9th, Lee's army, a shell of its former self, exhausted, surrounded, and without supplies, surrendered. The terms of surrender were generous for the South, but it was to be a formal affair. The Confederates were to march in military order and stack arms in the presence of the Union Army. It would be a great honor for whomever Grant chose to represent the victorious army. Grant chose General Joshua Chamberlain. At sunrise on April 12th, Chamberlain assembled his troops for the ceremony. His men formed along the main street of Appomattox Courthouse.
Before us, in proud humiliation, stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve. Standing before us now, thin, worn and famished, but erect and with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured?
There was the soft, ordered slapping of hands on wood and metal, and along the whole line, regiment by regiment, in succession, muskets rose with a simultaneous gleaming to the position of the old carry, the marching salute. At the head of the Confederate column, General John B. Gordon, riding disconsolately with bowed head, caught the sound of shifting arms. The meaning suddenly dawned on him, and in an instant the spirit of the occasion changed. Gordon wheeled toward the 3rd Brigade. Rider and horse made one superb uplifted figure, the Confederate general dropping his sword point to the toe of his boot as he returned Chamberlain's compliment. Then, facing his own command, Gordon ordered his troops to pass with the same position of the manual. the two armies honoring one another in a final salute.
On our part, not a sound of trumpet more, nor roll of drum, not a cheer, nor word, nor whisper of vainglorying, nor motion of man, standing again at the order, but an awed stillness rather, and breath-holding, as if it were the passing of the dead.
No conversation was allowed between the two armies as the surrender was being made, but occasionally a pleasant word would be exchanged. The division we had encountered on several fields of battle halted in our front, and as they were stacking their arms, they learned to what division we belonged, while one of them cried in a jocose manner, "Well, old fellows, we've met you again."
And thus the Army of Northern Virginia passed into history. The boys of the 20th Maine, like most of the rest of the Army of the Potomac, eventually marched back to Washington, D.C., where on May 23rd, they participated in a grand review of victory. It was a sentimental journey, ending up on the spot where 3 years before, they had made their stumbling debut. Two weeks later, the men were mustered out of service, and they went home to resume their civilian lives. Theodore Garish moved to Portland, Maine, where he eventually became a Protestant minister and wrote his memoirs. Others went back to become lumberjacks and fishermen, farmers or clerks. Joshua Chamberlain went back to his beloved Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. He later became governor and served 4 terms. Some years later, he received an unexpected letter in the mail addressed from a member of the 15th Alabama. It read,
"Dear Sir, I want to tell you of a little passage in the Battle of Round Top Gettysburg concerning you and me, which I am now glad of. Twice in that fight, I had your life in my hands. I got a safe place between 2 big rocks and drew bead fair and square on you. You were standing in the open behind the center of your line, fully exposed. I knew your rank by your uniform and your actions, and I thought it a mighty good thing to put you out of the way. I rested my gun on the rock and took a steady aim. I started to pull the trigger, but some queer notion stopped me. And then I got ashamed of my weakness and went through the same motions again. I had you perfectly certain, but that same queer something shut right down on me. I couldn't pull the trigger and gave it up. That is, your life. I am glad of it now and hope you are too. Yours truly."
We've been tenting tonight on the old campground, thinking of days gone by, of the loved ones at home who gave us a hand, and a tear that said goodbye. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. We are tired of war on the old campground. Many are brave and true, left their home. Others been wounded long. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for